So the Wednesday crowd continues to run laps around the Sunday crowd. I guess maybe just the Wednesday night crowd absorbs the scriptures faster, because here we are all the way in chapter 4 of Genesis. I don't know, maybe it's the speaker. Might have something to do with it. But we may end up finishing the Old Testament before we finish the New Testament, and that's really not supposed to happen. But we're in chapter 4, and after chapter 3, everything has fallen into its place for the good or for the bad. Mankind now knows where it stands with the Lord. Mankind was once on the inside looking out. Now mankind is on the outside looking in. And so mankind needs a lot of help now. Spiritual life and life in general is no longer effortless as it was. Now everything's a struggle. Life's a struggle. Spiritual life, our connection with God, it's all a struggle. It all takes work now. And that's what chapter 4 brings us to, that moving forward from that base, that new normal for the planet. This moving forward, and without even reading ahead, without reading forward of where we are in Genesis 4, you just know right off the bat that things are going to be a mess as we begin to read what happens to fallen people on a fallen planet. And sure enough, that's what we get. You know, we never get to see childbirth and child rearing from that perfect state. That all begins tonight here in Genesis 4 from the fallen state. So we're expecting the worst now as we read Genesis, and we're hoping for those bright spots along the way, and that's what we're going to find in the scriptures. That'll be exactly what we get. So let's begin reading at verse 1, and we'll just see how far we get tonight. I'd like to get the 4th chapter done, but that may be a bit overzealous. So we'll see. Verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. All right, Adam knew Eve. We know what that means, right? This is not talking about Adam and Eve going out to an ice cream social and getting to know one another better. Now, this is a biblical euphemism, which is speaking of the fact that Adam, at this point, knows his wife in the most intimate way that a man can know a woman. So let's just go ahead and say it. This is Adam and Eve having sex in Genesis chapter 4. That same euphemism is used in the Greek New Testament when it speaks of Mary and Joseph. There in Matthew chapter 1, verse 25, it says that Joseph did not know Mary until after Jesus was born. So we understand what's being said with this word, to know. And it really is a great way to depict sex. We're going to talk in the future about how sex is more than just two bodies coming together for some fun or exercise, but sex is a mysterious and powerful joining together of two souls. So obviously that's why it's so important that we as people handle sex the way that God tells us to in the scriptures. And we find out sex outside of marriage is extremely destructive to the soul. That's why Paul says all other sins are outside the body. This one's in the body. This area of sexual sin, this stuff will mess you up. But what do? We take all the other sins seriously, and most of the world, sometimes even Christians, unfortunately, don't like to take what God says about sex very seriously. But it is a very serious subject, and for now, I digress. That'll be a topic for a future study, and we'll label that one on the slide, the welcome slide, like, maybe PG-13 or whatever we have to do there. But so this coming together of Adam and Eve becomes pregnant with Cain. So how did Eve get pregnant with Cain? This was from sleeping with her husband. Now, I know I'm dwelling on an obvious point, but I want to emphasize that because of all the weird stuff floating around out there in the world about Adam and Eve. Unfortunately, it's even in some Christian circles where they will teach something to the effect of Eve had sex with the serpent in the garden. Have you ever heard this? It's quite popular out there, believe it or not. Eve had sex with the serpent, and from that was born Cain. Therefore, Cain is the son, the seed of Satan. No, that is not at all what took place. We read it. It's very clear. This was from Adam and Eve. This was Adam's child. Cain is born. And I've heard other crazy stuff too, like Eve is Adam's second wife. His first wife was named Lilith. You can say anything you want. You can make up, if you're just making stuff up, you might as well make it good. But of course, we stick with what the Bible says because we know the Bible is truth. This is the story. There's nothing else outside of this. So don't get confused by any of that other garbage that is taught about Adam and Eve. This is pretty standard. Now, verse 4, unfortunately for me, verse 1. I don't know why I said verse 4. Verse 1, unfortunately for me, skips some really important stuff that I would like to know. I would really like to hear the account of this first pregnancy because this is an all-new thing. This has not happened before. This was the very first time that a woman got pregnant, and I would like to know whether God gave Adam and Eve instruction about pregnancy or if he just kind of let them figure it out on their own as they went. I do hope that God at least gave Adam some heads up on the fact that his wife was going to be putting on a little bit of weight, but it was for the purpose of the child. That would have spared Adam for maybe speaking up, acknowledging it, and getting himself in a whole lot of trouble, being driven even further away from the Garden of Eden, like to the couch. So we don't know how this first pregnancy went. We don't know if they were prepared for it, if they were learning as they went. But she makes it through, surprises and all, however it happened. Cain is born. And that's when the fun really began, because that's when Adam and Eve began to raise Cain. Sorry, I got to throw that in a few times tonight. There will be at least one more probably. So the name Cain means gotten or acquired. Gotten or acquired. And based on the name that Eve gives to her son, it would seem that she is thinking, okay, this is the one. I've gotten him. This is the seed that God promised me in Genesis 3:15. I have acquired the son that would come along and crush the head of the serpent and help us to win this battle. But Eve, you are thousands of years too early. Pull back on the bridle a little bit. Calm down. I know there's been a promise, but you haven't acquired the Messiah yet. You've acquired just a sinner and a really bad example of one. And so they try again. Surely the second child will be that promised seed, right? Verse 2. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. So check this out. Cain means gotten or acquired, and Abel means vanity or useless. It's that same word that Solomon uses 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity, says the preacher. Same word. That's what Eve named her second born. Mothers, I don't recommend that you name your child useless. Even when you're tempted to call the child useless, don't do it. Avoid that, because man, is that damaging to the child's self-worth. And, with naming your kid useless, I'm thinking to myself, Eve is not winning any Mother of the Year awards here. Then again, she's the only mother, so I guess she does win that award, but she doesn't deserve it. It's a terrible thing to name your kid useless. But listen, understand what is happening here through this convention of naming the kids. First, there's Cain, and she says, acquired, check mark, done, the promised seed. But as time passes and Cain grows, no doubt it becomes evident Cain can't be the one. He's defective. He's a sinner. He's not the Messiah. He's not even a saint. All right. Then Abel is born, and Eve says, oh, vanity. This one's useless too. This isn't the promised son either. He's not the promised seed. I'm over too. So if you have kids, maybe you can relate to this a little bit. You're expecting that child to come out perfectly, just the best child on the planet, always well behaved, especially if it's your first one. You don't know what you're doing, and you believe the psychiatrists and the theorists that say mankind is born basically good. And you're expecting some good things with that first child, and then that first child is born, and before long, they hit the 2-year-old thing and the 3-year-old thing, the terrible twos. And it's at that point where you realize that the kid that was born was no saint. That kid was not born basically good. That child was born inherently evil, and you have some work to do. All right? You never really have to give your kids lessons on how to be sinners. You don't have to teach them that. Like a couple years old, begin to teach them how to throw fits. And then when they get 4 or 5 years old, you teach them how to lie. And then when they get a little older, you don't have to do any of that. They come out of the womb with inherent sin in them, and it becomes very obvious to us that, we are born with a sin nature. It doesn't even so much matter if we sin. It's just the fact that we are born as sinners. We are conceived in sin. And so the stuff that doesn't come naturally, now you got to raise the child to do those things. It's a lot of work. You got to try to drive that poor behavior out as much as you can. I've heard it said before that in raising our kids, sometimes we have to apply the board of education to the seat of learning. If you know what I mean. Spare the rod, spoil the child. It's just part of the fall now. Reading on, it says, "Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." So these two boys picked two different vocations, two different career paths. Cain was the chip off the old block. He continues right on there in the family business. Adam and Son fruit and veggie stand. They're farmers. They're working the fruits and the vegetables, and then there's Abel who comes along, and he's a trendsetter. He's a path maker. He goes his own way. He determines to be the first shepherd. And Abel's not going to be the Messiah either. He's not going to be the promised seed, but I guess he does have that one thing in common with the Messiah, and that is that he would be a shepherd. And of course, spiritually, Christ is our great shepherd. And you truly can see a lot of connections between Abel and Christ. You can actually consider Abel a type of Christ. There's a lot of similarities and connections there. I won't go into all of them tonight, but you can think them through. Verse 3. "And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord." Verse 4. "Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering." Verse 5. "But he did not respect Cain and his offering." And God definitely somehow communicated to those boys what their status was for their offering. We don't know how he did it, but this was very early on where it was a regular thing for God to come down and walk with them and talk with them. So God lets them know whether their sacrifice, their offering was received or not. And reading on in verse 4. "Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." Now today we call that depression. A fallen countenance is depression. He's angry, his countenance has fallen. Verse 6. "So the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?'" Verse 7. "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." All right, now we see already that one of the first demands of the Creator upon fallen mankind is that mankind begin to bring offerings to atone for sin. Cain's offering would cost him effort. He had to work for it. He had to plant. He had to cultivate. He had to prepare the fruits and the vegetables, whatever he was offering up to the Lord. So it was effort. But Abel's offering would cost him pain. He would have to kill an animal that he has spent time feeding, raising, protecting, and developing an attachment to. Have you ever seen lambs? They are adorable. Not so much when they get a little older, but I mean, they are adorable. As you know, the Jews used to keep them for pets. They're such cool animals that you really do develop an attachment to. And so that offering of Abel cost him some pain. He had to kill this thing. And he wasn't a trained killer. This was the first time. And when you look at the two offerings, you would think that Cain's offering would be the one that would get the Lord's attention. Man, look how much energy he put into that offering. And what a beautiful fruit basket you've brought me, the Lord might say. Great work, buddy. You know, I like this offering. And then there's Abel over there standing with bloody hands and an animal carcass. You know, which one do you think looks more appealing to the Lord? This lovely bouquet, this lovely display of fruits and vegetables, or this bloody carcass, this slain, slaughtered animal? Well, as you know, the Lord preferred Abel's sacrifice. It reminds me of something that David once said. When a piece of land and some animals were offered up to him to offer up to the Lord, to have a time of offering to the Lord, and those things were offered to David completely free of charge, but David refused. He said, I'm going to pay top dollar for this. I'm paying top dollar for the land to hold the ceremony on, and I'm paying top dollar for the animals to sacrifice to the Lord. Because why? David said, I will not offer something to the Lord that costs me nothing. There's got to be a cost there. And certainly that is a big part of what the Lord was trying to bring out in this offering. I do believe God was going for an attitude of contrition. And, you know, Cain would come forward in pride and enthusiasm with what he's done, and Abel would come forward with head bowed low in contrition, brokenness over what had to happen. And I can kind of agree with God on this one, but from a completely different angle. You know, if you invite me over for dinner and you put fruits and vegetables on my plate as my dinner, I'll be polite and I'll eat it. But you better believe on the way home, I'm stopping at Ruby Tuesday and get me a steak. That's a better offering. But the Lord, it's different for the Lord. That's not why God favored Abel's meat offering. To really understand this, we read it. The key is found in verse 6. This offering, both of these offerings, according to God, were all about right and wrong. They were all about doing well and not doing well. Did you see that? You can look at it right there in the scriptures. I don't want you to miss it. The offerings were all about doing well and not doing well, which means what? It means that the Lord had clearly communicated with both of these boys what his expectations were for these offerings that they were to bring. We don't know what he said because it's not recorded in scriptures. We just know they knew. This is a matter of right and wrong. So God either communicated the exact offering to bring, either that, or God at the very least communicated the attitude of the heart that was to be in place when those offerings were brought. And with God, he has that right to mandate how mankind worships him. That is his right based on the merits of him being God. That is his prerogative completely, to tell mankind that there are acceptable ways to worship him and there are unacceptable ways to worship him. He really truly is not an anything goes God. I know he's painted that way a lot in the Christianity that you see in our country and across the world, but he's not an anything goes God. Yeah, he looks at the heart. He takes that into account. He's very forgiving. He's very merciful, but he also really cares that you understand him for who he truly is, because he has revealed himself to you in the scriptures. And he cares that you worship him in the proper ways. He's told us how. He's revealed all of those things to us through the Bible. That's why our noses always need to be in the book, because there's a right way to approach God and there's a wrong way to approach God, and we'll want to be very familiar with that. Now, if Cain did well, if he did right as instructed, then there would be no reason for him to hang his head, because his offering would have been accepted by the Lord. So don't feel bad for Cain. Don't think this is God picking on Cain. No, this is Cain deliberately going against the commands of the Lord. He either brought the wrong offering or he came with the wrong motivation. Either way, Cain's anger and his depression are no one's fault but his own. That's what the Lord says. So first off, what if it was the wrong offering? What if God directly called for a lamb to be brought as an offering? That would fit the types of the entire Bible. And if that was the case, then why didn't Cain bring the lamb? You can only wonder of some of the things that might be going through his head, something to the effect of, well, I know God said a slaughtered lamb is what I'm supposed to bring, but I'm going to do both of us a favor. I'm going to bring fruits and vegetables. I'm going to bring the best I have from the field. I'm going to work hard. That'll impress God because of the labor that I put into this. I worked hard to get these things, and I'm going to bring this beautiful display to the Lord and no bloody mess. Well, but if the Lord called for a lamb, then he brought the wrong offering. It may have been that both offerings were acceptable. They are certainly both held up in the law, the sacrificial system, as acceptable offerings, the fruit and grain offerings, the meat offerings. So maybe both were acceptable. And it could just be a matter of the heart with Cain. And if that's the case, Cain didn't offer it up with the right heart. Maybe he was prideful over what he had done and what he had brought. Maybe he was indifferent to the offering, or maybe he was hesitant and reluctant to bring an offering at all. We don't know. All we know is that this offering seemed to matter quite a bit to the Lord, and that tells me that this offering was all about sin. And so, for an offering to cover sin, for an offering to deal with sin, there must be reverence and contrition. And as you'll see, that's just not Cain's style. That's not who he is. Whatever the case may be, we do know from the New Testament that the deciding factor here in the acceptance of these offerings all boils down to faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, faith. Abel was trusting God and being obedient, and Cain was doing what he was doing ad hoc. He was doing his own thing. He was on his own program. But the scriptures there in Hebrews 11:4 tells us that Abel's offering was more excellent because Abel brought his offering by faith. That tells me something. That tells me that Abel did not understand why he was bringing the offering that he was bringing. If you're doing something by faith, that means you don't understand what's going on. You don't see, right? It tells me that Abel likely didn't want this to happen. I mean, can you imagine what he thought here? I would imagine that Abel did not fully understand what this offering was all about. He did not fully want to bring this offering. He probably would have chosen something completely different. But the Lord had called for the lamb. The Lord had called for this offering. And so Abel comes and just says by faith, you know what? By faith, I'm just trusting that God knows what he's talking about when God tells me how to approach him in worship. Amazing. So I hope you're applying these things as we go, because there's a lot of things that we're picking up that we can connect to our spiritual life here. Verse 7 ends with a very sober warning for Cain. Cain was told to be careful. He was starting down a slippery slope, a problematic path. He was heading off in a direction that had a lot of danger to it. He had essentially opened the door in his resistance to worship of God. And with the opening of that door, here's this warning from the Lord that sin is crouching outside the door. You know, like you walk outside your door and there's a full-grown tiger crouching in the bushes waiting to pounce on you. He's been watching you through the windows, and now you've cracked the door open and he's waiting to pounce. And that's your sin. That's a warning from God to Cain. Cain, don't open this door. Don't continue down this path, because What God is saying is that your sin will pounce on you. Ultimately, it will control you and destroy you. If you don't like being controlled, too bad. You're controlled by one thing or another. You're either controlled by sin and the flesh, or you are controlled and led by the Holy Spirit. Romans 6:16 tells us you are slaves to whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. Those are the only two choices. In this life, you can be obedient to God or you can do something else. And that falls under the category of sin. And sin leads to death. Verse 8. Now Cain talked with his brother Abel, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Cain rose up. I could make another Raising Cain joke, but I won't. I'm going to let that go. The first one didn't go over, so. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Cain talked with Abel first. I don't know what they said. I would imagine that the conversation was heated. All I know is that it certainly did not help to calm Cain's anger and jealousy. The Lord had warned him, but that warning went unheeded. He did not correct his path. Just think about that. God stopped him where he was. He was heading down the path to murder. God stopped him. God warned him. But Cain proceeded and advanced against the warnings of God, and now he's lost control. God told him, you could rule over this. Sin desires to slay you, to control you, but you could control it, and that's a word for us too. We're given that same word in Scriptures that God has given us the power through the Spirit to control the passions and the desires of the flesh. No one said it's easy. It's tough. Paul looked at it as if he was crucifying himself every day. So that tells you it's a tough battle. But it's something that can be done. And it's all about which aspect of our lives we're feeding. When you come to Christ, your sinful nature, your fallen flesh does not disappear. Would to God that it did. I would be the first one to champion that up here on the stage, but that is not how it happens. Your sinful nature stays with you. But now upon salvation, the Spirit of Christ comes in and regenerates you. The Holy Spirit fills you, empowers you for service in the baptism. And now you're equipped, you're empowered to win those daily battles over the flesh, but it's still up to you. There's that story, you might have heard it before, of the Native American Indian, a grandfather who said to his son, in trying to explain the inner turmoil between good and evil that was in him, he said to his son, there are two wolves inside of me, and they're fighting. And the grandson asked his grandfather, well, who wins? And the grandfather said, whichever wolf I feed. You've probably heard that, and that's a good spiritual truth because it really is the same way. If you, as a Christian, continue to feed the flesh, you are never going to know what the victory of overcoming the flesh is like. You're never going to know the power that is in you from Christ that could help you win those things. Instead, you're feeding the flesh. You're feeding those ungodly passions. You're watching things. You're listening to things that are inflaming those passions. And so it is your flesh that becomes the strong one. That's the one you're feeding. But if you will feed your spirit in that same way, turn from the wickedness and the evil influence and spend your time and energy investing in feeding your spiritual life with good things, K-love, and Bible study and prayer. Those are the things that cause the spirit to grow and the spirit to be strong. That's what causes the spirit to win out over the flesh in our lives. But Cain spurned those warnings from God. His anger continues to boil. And you know what Jesus said about anger there in Matthew chapter 5? He said basically murder is just anger that is full grown. You got anger as the seed. And anger, the seed, leads to hatred, the root. And hatred, the root, leads to murder, the fruit. And that's the whole process right there. And Jesus said, if any of you are angry with your brother without a cause, you are in danger of judgment. That's where it all begins. That is the planting of the seed. And so if that seed of anger is in there, you have to pluck it up. You have to get rid of it. Because if you don't, it continues to grow. It turns into a root of bitterness and hatred. And if you've got hatred in your heart for another person, you are pretty far along in the process, and you're not all that far away from, taking matters into your own hands. It's a very important thing. If it's the seed of hate, if it's the seed of anger, pluck it up. If it's the root of hatred, chop that thing down. Because those things lead to the full-blown fruit of that sin. The Apostle John in 1 John chapter 3, verse 15 said, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer. So, do you have anyone in your life that when you hear their name, you get that flinch, that tinge? You feel it. Your countenance changes. Something happens in you, someplace deep when you hear that name. I don't know, that sounds like anger or maybe hatred, but all I can tell you is if you hate your brother, that's one and the same in the heart as if you had murdered that person. Cain's sin of murder was especially grotesque, especially heinous when you consider the details. This was not self-defense. This was not a crime of passion in a moment. This was carefully planned. This was premeditated murder. And Cain, no doubt, before he ever physically murdered Abel, had murdered him in his heart many times over. And man, we got to be careful with that. Watch what your heart is doing. How do you get rid of that stuff? If you're upset and angry with a person, if you hate a person, you need to pray. You need to ask for help. You need to speak those things out loud every day. Lord, I forgive them. I forgive them. Lord, I love them. I choose to love them. Doesn't matter what my emotions feel. I choose this. I choose to forgive. I choose to love. The Lord said those are decisions that we make. If they weren't decisions that we make, then Jesus could not say, forgive your enemies. Forgive those that have trespassed against you. He couldn't say that if it was not within our power to do. But it is within our power. And so he murders his brother. Cain murders Abel because Cain hated his brother. How long did Cain hate his brother? Just as long as he was able. How did he kill his brother? It wasn't an AR-15, I know that. Maybe they had knives, something sharp, I don't know. More than likely it was a rock. More than likely Adam and Eve then passed some pretty intense and strict rock control legislation so that nothing like this would ever happen again. Because that's all you have to do against crime is legislate against it, and that takes care of it, right? Or maybe is it that the crime, that the sin, that the problem is with the human heart? You legislate against guns? Well, there's still knives. Look at London. London, I believe, right? They legislated against guns. And the same amount of murders took place. They were just with knives now. They were even more personal. And if you legislate against knives, then people will use rocks. Good luck legislating against rocks. I mean, you just reach a bottom point where you realize, okay, there's nothing we can do. If murder is in the heart of a people, there's no way to stop that. Because people are going to find a way. If murder is in your heart, you're going to murder. The human heart is the problem. A sinful human heart is the problem. And Jesus Christ is the only one that can cleanse the human heart. And the world can call Christians dumb all they want. But mark my words, there is a great darkness coming to this planet. It has already begun. It includes an apostasy from the church. You know what the word apostasy means? It means a turning away. That means these are church people. These are people that knew Christ and they are apostatizing. They are turning away from the Lord. And that is accompanied by a great and strong and powerful spirit of Antichrist that is in the unbelieving world. You bring those things together, the spirit of Antichrist in the unbelieving world, the apostasy of the church, and what you end up with is a world that is filled with unthinkable perversity and unthinkable violence. Isn't that what the scriptures tell us that all things are trending toward? And that is the way things will go. There's no stopping that. It is a prophetic certainty. It's going to happen. And you can see the track we're on. We are on that track. You think things are violent now. You think things are messed up now. You haven't seen anything yet. I mean, if the Bible calls this out as unthinkable perversity and unthinkable hatred and violence, man, it's got to be bad. And it will be. And the day is coming when they will regret the pushing away of the Christian influence. The day is coming when they regret the silencing of God's preachers. The day is coming when they regret pushing away and discarding the very laws of God because they had been warned. They had been warned. And when you're warned, and just as Cain was, you spurn those warnings, then what can we say? Destruction is your just due. That is coming. I would love to see a major turn in our planet. I would love to see this country have an incredible revival of Christianity and good morals. I would love to see things change. And if it does, that's wonderful. But I can tell you it's not going to last long. It has to go the direction He says it's going. It's going to, because the problem is the human heart. The problem is the pushing away of God's laws and God's warnings, even as Cain. And the fruit of that is destruction.